Okay, back by popular demand, the recordings of the sections. So 19.1 offers us a intro to the diversity of protists. So at this point, we don't really know what protists are. There's a new kind of organism to us. They may look familiar, they may sound familiar, but as of yet, we haven't learned what they are exactly. So first thing is what they do, right? So protists have plant-like abilities and also animal-like abilities, but also fungus-like abilities. And that's pretty interesting, right? It's kind of the whole basis of this kingdom, protists, that they have things kind of like other kingdoms, but not enough to be considered that. So we'll be talking about that. So plant-like protists, they do photosynthesis just like plants, but they don't have roots or stems or leaves or anything like that. Now, over here, like a cellular version, and over here, like seaweed, this is a huge, as you can see the diver right there, multicellular version, but still, because no roots, still not a plant technically. Now, there are also fungus-like protists. They are fungus-like because they digest the dead things in the organisms and all things around it. So that makes them heterotrophs. And why they're not fungi is because they can move. Now, fungi cannot move. They can grow, they can spread, but they can't technically move. But these guys can, which makes them kind of like animals. So which one are they, animal or fungus? Don't know. So we put it in the protist category. So this whole thing started when the Six Kingdoms model came about, and this is just all of them, right? We can exclude bacteria and archaea because we know that those are prokaryotes. The protist kingdom is a bunch of eukaryotes, so they do have nuclei, and they range from single cellular to multicellular to colonial, so lots of different kinds of things. So we could do molecular data research on them and use that to put them in clades. So far this hasn't happened yet. They're just put into the kingdom of Protista, but they probably will be reclassified upon figuring out what their DNA says. So, section 2, I'm going to focus on animal-like protists, right? Well, why are they called animal-like protists? It is because of their eating habits, right? So they eat other things, but they also are not multicellular, so we can't classify them as an organism by definition of what an animal is. They can't call that an animal. Animals are multicellular. So they're protozoa. Well, okay, what does that mean? Well, they have animal-like characteristics, but they're not going to be characterized as animals. So the first class we're going to talk about, and all the classes of animal-like protists are divided by how they move pretty much, would be the zooflagellate. So the zooflagellate is a type of protozoa that is a animal-like protist with a flagella, right? Sometimes the name gives us a hint of what the characteristics of an organism is, and this is just a case that's just like that, right? Zooflagellates, zoo means animal, flagellate means has a flagella, so it's an animal-like thing with a flagella. Some of them move with these things called pseudopods. This is an amoeba here. Now, pseudopod literally means false foot. Why false foot? Well, because this is not like an anatomical structure or a body or anything. It's only one cell, so it doesn't have a foot, really, right? But it is able to manipulate its cell membrane by pushing or pulling its cell cytoplasm, right? So if it wants to move one direction, it will just push its cytoplasm in that direction, and the plasma membrane will kind of roll, and the back end of it will roll to meet with it. And here you can see this amoeba is surrounding some kind of food particle it's going to eat using its pseudopods. Now, some of them are foraminifera or foraminifera. All right, so that word foramen means little hole in Latin. So these are just protists that are described by having holes, right? And they do also have the ability to change shape as they move. They're just neat, and they are quite large. You can't see them with the naked eye. You don't need a microscope. Our last class is going to be not flagella, the protist-like animals that move. Sorry, animal-like protists that move around by using these things called cilia. So cilia seem to be a lot like flagella, but there are some important differences, mostly the size and the quantity. So cilia are pretty small, as you can see. They are much smaller than the flagella, and they are more numerous. They're going to be in, the thousands instead of, one or two like the flagella. Most important for us to know would be the kind of diseases these protists can cause, right? The most famous one is the Plasmodium, right? That is a parasite that causes malaria and spread by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes go and bite people, and in their stomach lies the Plasmodium protista. And when that gets into our bloodstream, it attacks things like our liver cells and our blood cells, makes us very sick and possibly even kill us. Second thing is sleeping sickness caused by trypanosoma trypanosomus, that is spread by a fly that has much of the same characteristics of the malaria infection. The last one is the Giardia infection. So this is coming from a Plasmodia like thing that we can't see with our naked eye, right? You can look at water and it looks crystal clear, but cellularly it's probably very dirty. How did it get there? Well, lots of animals poop in the water, in the river, in the lake, or whatever, and their fecal matter can contain this Giardia protist, and just like drinking it will get into our digestive system, and that can cause us to have diarrhea. It can be very dangerous if you're out on a hike and you don't have help nearby. Okay, section 3. So we're going to be talking about plant-like protists. So plant-like protists are so named because they are like plants but don't technically qualify as plants. Why is that? Well, because they don't have roots, stems, or leaves. They can be multicellular, they can be colonial, like these living together, or they can be single-celled, like this guy all the way over here, right? Now, euglenoids are one category of plant-like protists. They are mostly photosynthetic, although some of them are heterotrophic. They're single-celled, and they have one or two flagella, and a special part of their anatomy is this pellicle here. As you can see from our electron microscope image, looks like they all kind of have the same shape. That's because they do, right? But they still do have chloroplast, nucleus, and all things like that. It's weird because you wouldn't expect a plant-like thing to have a flagella, but these do. Second thing is a dinoflagellate. Right, just like the other thing we talked about, we always want to look at the name of something and see if it tells any hints. Dinoflagellates have flagella in their names because they have flagella, right? 2 specifically. Now, they can be bioluminescent, which is really neat. That means they can glow when they're disturbed into cool glow up colors like a glow stick. But they can cause this really bad situation called red tide, which is where they are overgrown. They block the sunlight from getting to the other photosynthesis performing organisms down there, and they can't do photosynthesis, which causes a lack of oxygen in the environment, and there could actually be these things called dead zones in the ocean where there is not enough oxygen for organisms to survive. Diatoms are protists with glass-like shells because their shells are made out of the same thing that glass is made out of, like silica. These are very important because they perform tons and tons of photosynthesis and release lots and lots of oxygen for us. They have other secondary uses. They can be used for filtration. They can be used as like a bug control. I just like looking at them though. They look really cool. I don't think any two are exactly the same, but that's so many of them that there's like miles of them on the ocean floor. Now, there are also algae, which are multicellular plant-like protists. You might be confused and think, well, look how big that is. Shouldn't that be a plant? It looks like a plant, but it's a plant-like protist. Why? They don't have roots, right? How do we classify them then? By their color of their pigment, right? So green algae have this type of chlorophyll called A and B. Brown algae have chlorophyll C. Red algae has chlorophyll A, but also this phycoerythrin, right? Anytime you see this erythrin prefix or suffix, it means something to do with red. Always think about red blood cells. What's the scientific name of red blood cell? Erythrocytes or erythrocytes. Now, they can reproduce asexually or sexually. Lots of them can do this thing called fragmentation, where if one piece breaks off and survives, it can just grow like a whole new type of organism of that type, right? Or they can make these things called zoospores, like Limnodontis does. Not always do they reproduce asexually, though. They can do sexual reproduction, and they will take place or will take hold of this whole alternation of generations thing, where the collection of chromosomes goes from haploid to diploid, so 1N being haploid, 2N being diploid, right? Whatever the organism looks like as its main thing or its mature body, that's what we call the dominant generation, right? So in this case, the haploid organism is the actual thing we think of when we think of the organism. I know it's a bit confusing, but In humans, it's the opposite, right? The diploid organism, like you and I, we are what's the grown-up version, and our haploid cells, like sperm and egg cells, are the reproductive cells. It's reversed in this case. Okay, the fungus like protists, so named because they decay organic matter just like fungi do, but they do not share one important aspect that fungus have, and that is that they are not going to stay still, right? So these things are fungus-like protists. They decompose like fungi, but they move like animals, and they're not running around or anything like that, but they do have the slight ability to move. So that disqualifies them from being considered a fungus. Now we're going to be talking about these things called slime molds. Slime molds come in two different flavors. There is the plasmodial slime mold on our left here, and we can identify it by one or just a few ginormous cells that have many, many nuclei in them. As opposed to that, there's the cellular slime mold, which contain lots and lots of independent cells. So I like to think of the plasmodial one as few cells, and the cellular one as many cells. Last type of mold we're going to be talking about is a water mold, right? So water molds cause things like the Great Potato Famine in the 1800s. They're made of branching cells, and they can also be parasites on fish or other plants too. So we're going to move on to fungi diversity. Fungi are a very interesting group of organisms. They are heterotrophs, but they don't have stomachs or anything. Instead, they digest things by kind of like sucking them up, right? So they absorb their food. They were mischaracterized as plants for a very long time, but they are very different. A couple of differences are that their cell walls are made of this stuff called chitin, whereas plant cell walls are made of cellulose. Plants do not eat other things usually. There are some exceptions like the Venus flytrap, but plants have chlorophyll and they do photosynthesis to get their glucose and raw materials. Fungi absorb nutrients through these structures called hyphae. So what is in a typical fungi, right? Well, they have the mycelium, which is the part that's underground that we don't see, and running through all that is the hyphae, right? And that is what can absorb things like a dying or dead organism. And there's also the fruiting body. This is actually the reproductive part of the mushroom. So this is the mushroom, but this is what we think of a mushroom up here. This is only the part we see. The mushroom itself can be much larger, but the function of this fruiting body is to be the reproductive spore-producing structure of the fungi. Fungi come in lots of different shapes and sizes. They are very, very interesting. They can come in all sorts of shapes, like this one over here, like what could that be? Or these over there, right? So there are primitive fungi that are aquatic, and they even have flagella, but there are also sac fungi that pre-produce with the thing of a reproductive sac, or also called an ascus. Yeast are a type of fungus that are single-celled sac fungi. Morels and truffles are multicellular sac fungi. So this is probably familiar to all of us, but this is a bread mold, right? It's found on bread, and it's usually there for a long time, but doesn't quite get this spread until they've been left there for a long time, right? They form this structure called a zygospore to reproduce. Now, a very important fungus group called a mycorrhizae belong to this group. Why are mycorrhizae important? They have a symbiotic relationship with roots of plants that help give them the nutrients they need to grow. Another group of fungi are the club fungi. They have a club-like shape, which is why they're named like that. Their reproductive structure is called a basidia. It includes things like mushrooms, puffballs, and shelf fungi. Like this guy here, if you were to touch or squeeze, it would have this puff come out. Those are all spores for the mushroom, reproductive spores, so it can grow and live in different areas. Fungi can be sexual or asexual to reproduce. Most can do both. Yeast are going to use budding to asexually reproduce, where they just break off from the larger one and become two smaller yeast cells. But when they want to or need to reproduce sexually, they form this thing called an asci for sexual reproduction. Now, the reproductive cycle of fungi is pretty tough, right? We have lots of different structures here, depending on what kind of fungi it is. If it's a club fungi, they'll make this basidia. If it is a bread mold, aka zygomycota, it will make this zygospore structure. And if it is a sac fungi, it will make an asci, right? And always look at the names and the reproductive structure. They're based off of the names. Ascomycota made the asci, Zygomycota make a zygospore, and Basidiomycota make a basidia. Use that to your advantage. Now, the life cycle, it can be asexual or sexual. Kind of depends on the environment, right? If there is a tough environment, they might use asexual reproduction. If it is an okay environment, they might use sexual production. They might use both depending on the environment. But on top of the ground, the reproductive structure is going to grow depending on whatever that is. And as we can see, the nuclei of these cells is going to be one end. So this is the haploid version of the organism, right? So this is not the dominant generation, as we would say, right? It's going to go through meiosis and release these zygotes, right? The zygotes are two ends, so they have two sets of homologous chromosomes, and these are full and they can grow. They will spread out, and they are spread by things like humans or birds or the wind. And when they hit the ground, they're going to start growing little strands of hyphae, right? We call that the mycelium, and it's going to keep growing until it's time for it to reproduce again, at which point in time it will make another fruiting body, and the cycle repeats itself again. So for bread molds, we're going to be looking at something a little different, right? They do asexual reproduction where they produce a hyphae, and the hyphae can grow and it's still one end, and this whole point is it's still the haploid version of the fungus, and it will grow on things like bread. So that would be asexual reproduction. But for sexual reproduction, the gametes are going to actually like merge at the tip of the hyphae, and when they fuse, they make this thing called a zygospore, as we can see right here in the middle, right? That is actually a diploid cell, and it will produce this thing called a sporangium, which is coming out of the zygospore right here through meiosis, which will separate the diploid cells back into haploid cells. The important thing to remember here is that all fungi form some kind of spore and zygote. Section 6, the ecology of fungi, how important they are to the environment. Their main thing that they do is recycle nutrients. They're a lot like bacteria in that case. They make sure that dead things don't just stay dead and lie there, that the composition of their bodies gets recycled back into the earth and the atmosphere so that other organisms can use them. Right? We call those decomposers, right? In fact, they are the main decomposers along with bacteria in every ecosystem, right? They decompose things like figs, twigs, logs, animals, and they return nutrients to the soil so things like plants can grow. But on the same side of the token, because they're able to break things down, that can damage things like trees and wooden structures. We don't want that. That would be bad, because what if it's a fruit tree or your house? You definitely don't want that being broken down. Fungi can also be a pathogen, right, such as ringworm, which sounds like a worm, but it is not. It is a fungus. But also something like athlete's foot. This down here is Dutch elm disease, and it is not good, right? Fungi, when they are acting as pathogens, they can cause a lot of harm and destruction, can even kill the organism. Fungi can also be good for the environment too that they live on, right? So fungi can be part of this team called a lichen. So a lichen is an algae plus a fungi, right? And then in between those is mycorrhizae, that same thing we talked about before, that lives on plant roots and supplies the roots with extra nutrients so the plant can survive better. So fungi are not all bad. In fact, they are mostly good, as we can see from the formation of lichens. Insects even can be affected by fungi, though. There is a particularly heinous fungi that will actually take control of the organism's brain and make it go out, and when it goes to wherever the spot the fungi wants it to be in, it will kill it and will grow out of its head. Right? It's called a cordyceps, and they're pretty scary, but you don't have to worry because they don't have any cordyceps fungi to our knowledge that affects humans. So. Now, fungi can be very useful for many different things. They are studied for lots of different reasons. First and foremost, and probably the oldest, is that they're used as food. Right? So I wouldn't recommend you go out and just eat every mushroom you see, but many of them are edible and they're very good. Second thing, like we've learned before, is that they produce things like antibiotics so they can help us kill things like bacterial infections. Now, one of the particularly interesting uses is as a model for biological systems. So fungi are not exactly good models for humans, but since they are eukaryotic, multicellular, most of them, they can be a pretty decent model. Is it perfect? No, but you can make lots and lots of fungi. You can do tests and run experiments on them, and it will be okay. You can't do that with a person or animals or anything like that. Okay. That concludes chapter 19. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you for watching.